If there's a long pause, please just fill that with applause. It's just me regaining my voice. Thank you. I was looking up at this, the urgency of growth, and thinking actually we should replace it with the pleasure of thinking. Just being in the room for the day and getting the chance to think and understand what's happening in the world and parts of the world you just don't know about, don't think about. I need to tell you that this particular final session, I think, was put on just for me, Robert, because my favorite kind of writing is the history of now. How do we understand the history of now? And there is no better writer on the history of now than Robert Kaplan, who is, I think, the most interesting historian and commentator on contemporary America. And so you can only disappoint from here on in, Robert.
Yeah.
There we are. And I should just warn you, I can't speak and Robert's not slept, so let's see how this goes. But Robert, I wonder whether we could start, what I hope we're going to do in this last session is just take a trip around the world and begin to understand how the Trump administration and how the United States is remaking its relationship with the world. But I wonder whether we could start by standing back. I suppose there are two views a year into President Trump's second term. One view is, put your head under a pillow, hide from the world for the next 3 years. It's only 3 years, and then things will resume. We'll be back to normal. And the other view is, no, Donald Trump is an expression of a fundamentally different America, and the world has changed irreversibly. Which one is it?
The second one. Definitely the second one. Particularly in his second term, where he's exercised the power of the presidency in a much more dynamic and focused way than in his first term. Look, at the end of World War II, the United States was the only major power that did not have its infrastructure destroyed by war. Britain, France, the Soviet Union, China, Japan were all bombed to smithereens. And the United States was left standing because the war was not fought there. It's the gift of geography, almost. And at that moment, the United States controlled 56% of the world's manufacturing capacity, while Europe was decimated. So it made logical sense that the United States would lead Europe, pay for its defense, build NATO, all of those things made sense when you just looked at these figures, kind of. And even so, it took the Korean War to get the United States back into Europe and NATO. People forget this little thing, that America's tendency right after World War II is initially to go isolationist again. It was the North Koreans' invasion of the South which gave Truman the political leverage to start NATO and move lots of money, the Marshall Plan, all of that to Europe. Well, the decades went on. 80 years is a long time in history. I mean, there are whole classes of Roman emperors, schools of Roman emperors that didn't last as long. And 80 years combined with such massive technological innovation, it's a long time, and nothing lasts forever, essentially. And 80 years on, the United States now is 16% of the world's manufacturing capacity rather than 56%. While Europe has grown, it's prospered, it's built middle classes, it has an enviable social safety net compared to the United States in many ways, so that the old system of the United States supporting to such a great degree the Western alliance, though it was great in a moral sense, in a liberal humanist sense, was no longer sustainable because the American middle class is not what it was a few decades ago. And Trump is an expression of that, so to speak.
So just on that, just starting, if you like, with the US and Europe, Robert, Do you think then that the economic bargain is broken?
The economic argument?
The economic bargain, the economic deal between Europe and the United States.
Yeah, it started breaking a few decades ago. As I told you before, there's a cliche line from Ernest Hemingway's book, The Sun Also Rises, where one character asked another, "How did you go bankrupt, Harry?" And the answer was, well, first gradually, then suddenly, And the gradual erosion of the strength of the United States middle class to support a great Navy, Air Force, all that for Europe. And the suddenness was two Middle East wars that didn't go very well. Yeah. And so that's where we are now. I think Trump, I know a lot of the people who worked in the Biden administration, and they are absolutely expert technocrats. I have the highest opinion of them. But the system, the orientation to the world that they were promoting was becoming unsustainable.
So just to kind of pursue that for a moment. So if Tony Blinken were here, the former U.S. Secretary of State, would he not say, no, Robert, our interests are in those alliances. Our interests are in rules-based systems. Our interests are in the fundamental alliance
That's
of the
a
West.
very abstract statement. I mean, you have to be almost an intellectual to understand what that means. The average American lower middle class person who's 2 paychecks away from a catastrophe cannot feel that. They've done polls on this. The number one issue for for the average American voter, the number one foreign issue is south of the border. Mexico, Central America, chaos in Central America that drives migrants through Mexico, into the north. And yet, if you read the American elite foreign policy journals, there's relatively little about it. There's a lot on Africa, a lot on Southeast Asia, but relatively little on this. So I agree with Tony Blinken. I think it was a good trade-off, basically. But that's not how the average American voter sees. It's not a lived experience for him or her.
So are you saying that we have essentially lived through 80 years of the quote-unquote American century, American engagement with the world, but the United States is reflexively isolationist and going back to a more isolationist response?
No, it's not. Trump is not an isolationist. Look what he's doing in Venezuela, which, by the way, has, I think, more oil reserves than any place any country in the Middle East. He's threatening to go into Nigeria to save Christians there. He's still aiding Ukraine. He is the most well-liked American leader in some time among not just the Israelis, but the Gulf Arabs as well. The Saudis, the Emiratis, the Kuwaitis, Bahrainis, they're all comfortable with Trump to the same degree that the Israelis are.
Right. So let's just understand then. So he's not an isolationist. He wants. So what's his foreign policy
this
position?
is the thing.
So how do you define him?
Yeah, I mean, look, he wants Greenland, and he wants it to be not the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America. So what's he saying? What's he telegraphing? He's saying that he's seeing a world of spheres of influence, where the United States sphere of influence is what he would call, as a real estate man, Greater North America, from Greenland south to Venezuela, essentially, because they're extensions of the North American continent, so to speak. He thinks in a very geographical, spatial terms, in terms of spheres of influence. That's why his attitude towards China is somewhat ambivalent.
Because it's far away.
People have arguments whether or not he would defend Taiwan or not, And the answer is nobody probably knows.
So Canada, Greenland, Venezuela, an American president who believes in the idea of Greater North America.
Right. Controlled by the United States with a subservient Canada, the United States footprint in Greenland, and and everywhere south to to Panama. That's his vision.
So let's then take a trip around the world. In that context, what's the meaning of Europe to Donald Trump?
Good question. Donald Trump did not remember. To understand the value of Europe, of the U.S.-European alliance, you have to go back to the end of World War II, the creation of NATO. It's 80 years is too far away for it to be lived history. So how do you know about this? Well, you read books. I mean, that's the only way we can know about the importance, the historical importance of the U.S.-European alliance is by reading. Because we're all readers, we take it for granted as something natural. But it's not natural. Donald Trump is not a reader. He's what I call post-literate. In other words, he's made an end run around literacy. He can manage his smartphone. He could probably read a one-page briefing. After that, he wants optics. He wants a video or something like that. So he's basically unknowing about the history and what forged the U.S.-European alliance.
Okay, so that's amazing. Is what that is. Let's go to the Middle East then, if it's right, Robert. So let's not start with Israel, Gaza. Let's start with Saudi.
Yeah.
How does he and how do you think the U.S. now sees the relationship with Saudi?
I think that Saudi Arabia is a hard country for Americans to feel,
love, yeah,
to like,
yeah,
because it's a medieval autocracy, essentially. However, and I've been to Saudi Arabia, and I've been back there, and over the last 8 or 9 years, there's been a peaceful revolution in Saudi Arabia. One half of the country, the women, have been, to a significant extent, liberated. And if you liberate one half of the population, you change the behavior of the other half.
Yeah, of course.
And Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, has done this not out of the goodness of his heart or his liberalism, but he needs to position Saudi Arabia for the post-oil age. And that requires a dynamic population. And you cannot have a dynamic population without liberating women to a great extent. So there's been essentially a social revolution in Saudi Arabia. And his relative friendliness with Israel is interesting, because one of the interesting things of the Gaza war is throughout the whole war, even at the worst moments, the Saudis were intimately cooperating with the Israelis. They didn't cut off their intelligence channels, nothing like that. And I think the only thing that is preventing a normalization of relations, we are all focused on Gaza and Hamas, is that the king, not the crown prince, the king, Salman, is still alive.
Yeah.
And remember, King Salman is the son of Ibn Saud. He's the youngest son, but he's the son. King Salman remembers Ibn Saud. He remembers his father. He remembers the glory days of King Faisal. This was all before Mohammed bin Salman was born, essentially. And it's in the DNA of King Salman that as the keeper of the holy places, you don't recognize any country in the region that is not Muslim, essentially. But I think when King Salman passes from the scene, that gives the crown prince an opening to move further along the lines of normalization.
So, but just to follow the logic of that, the old Kissinger line about Europe, who do I call, what is becoming clear in the Middle East is Mohammed bin Salman.
Yeah.
Donald Trump, the call goes, it's not Qatar, it's not the UAE.
It's not Egypt even.
It's not Egypt,
Yeah.
it's MBS.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's more than a personal issue, that's now a financial, even cultural one.
Right, it is. Remember, Egypt should be the leader. It was the leader of the Arab world for a long time, but it's too enmeshed in its own economic, social challenges. I mean, Egypt has Egypt's regime is what I call a dead-end regime.
Yeah.
You can't have real economic liberalization when the army controls the economy.
So can we just keep going around the world? I was really struck, at the end of the conversation with Nadia and with Patrick Sanders, there was a question like, what's the one thing we haven't thought about? And Patrick Sanders said, nuclear proliferation.
Yeah.
It's like, good grief, how many things do we have to worry about? But I think about that in the context of Russia.
Yeah.
Do you look at Russia, Robert, and think that is likewise a generational contest with the United States that is going to run to 2050? Or is this a problem that ends when Putin ends?
Vladimir Putin has more power than any Russian leader since Joseph Stalin. And everyone who succeeded Stalin, even though it was the Cold War, even though we were against the communists, there were all those leaders after Stalin were survivors of Stalin's purges. And how do you survive Stalin's purge? You have no opinions on anything. So that while we were dealing officially with a communist enemy, really we were dealing with a bunch of risk-averse conservative men, And when they weren't risk-averse, like Khrushchev in the Cuban Missile Crisis, they were thrown out of office.
Right.
There was a penalty to be paid for that. And so, Putin scares me because the one thing I fear more than Putin's rule is what happens to Russia after he leaves.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because I think, the Ukraine, why did World War I change the 20th century? Because it went on for 4 long years. Had it ended in 1915 instead of 1918, Hitler never would have come to power, the Habsburg Empire wouldn't have collapsed, all of these things. Well, the Ukraine war has been going on for 4 years. It'll be 4 years in February. And I think what it's doing gradually, and this is off the news because nobody's focuses on it, is it's weakening the Russian Empire as a whole. Russia has less, it's harder for Russia to project power in the Caucasus, in former Soviet Central Asia, in Siberia, all the Muslim and republics in Siberia, and in the Russian Far East. And because Putin doesn't have a system, there's no Politburo around him. When he goes, it's unclear what will happen, who will rule, and Russia could become a kind of low-calorie version of the former Yugoslavia.
Right. Well, then let's go to China.
Yeah.
This is a lot to take in, Robert. Let's go to China. So I think you were saying that your next book is on the advisors, the China policymakers, the China thinkers. I spent some of the 90s in China. I look at what's happening in the Western China, and I just think it's a mistake. I think the demonization of China is a mistake.
Yeah.
I think the description of China as a thief and a threat is a mistake and likely to just make matters worse with China. But that's not a popular view these days.
I know.
So tell me where you think the US ends up with China.
One of the scariest things about Washington is that the one thing both parties agree on is they both hate China.
Yeah.
No, really. And look, we've talked about the Middle East, about the Ukraine. The Ukraine and Middle East wars, the Gaza war, we can all argue about them and have heated discussions about them, but they have not changed people's savings accounts. People look at their retirement accounts every month, and they haven't been adversely affected by these wars. It's been impressive the way the financial community has priced in these wars. Whereas if you had an accidental conflict, between the United States, China, and for reasons we don't have time to discuss, I could pull in Japan as well. You'd have the three largest economies in a high-end war, and people would look at their retirement accounts and boom. And the Federal Reserve wouldn't have an easy answer like it did, when COVID first erupted. And you could say, yeah, but nobody wants a war. That's true. Nobody wants a war precisely for the reasons I just said, though they never articulate it that way. It's like hydrogen bombs kept the peace in Europe during the Cold War. The fear of world economic catastrophe keeps the peace between China and the U.S. But what we know from history is accidents happen. When neither side wants a war, there's still a war. And while we're all focused on the Chinese economy and the complexities of of China AI and its economy and trade with the U.S. There's a whole other subculture that is just concerned with war games between the U.S. and China, both on the U.S. side and the Pentagon, and on the Chinese side. There's a whole other subculture that is essentially practicing for war. For years now, it's been said, and it's true, that in the Pentagon is focused on China as the pacing threat, essentially. The Pentagon does the Middle East because it has to. It does Europe and Ukraine because it has to. But the Pentagon loves contemplating military scenarios with China. And that's really where the focus is. And it's the same on the Chinese side.
So can we step back and finish up with, if you like, a picture of the world in the next decade? And I don't know, how many years ago did you write The Coming Anarchy? It must be 30-odd years ago.
31 years ago.
So I was thinking about that, Robert, because if you put together what we've heard today about the United States, which is essentially two things. One is enormous economic power, and probably consolidating economic power, and at the same time, quite a lot of disregard for old rules-based systems, old conventions, certainly the economic world order as was. You would come away with a view that says, that is to me very confusing, because you have greater American power in the decade to come, but less respect for international rules and the underpinnings of the so-called West.
Right.
Is that where we're headed?
I think that's where we're headed. It's for all of the mistakes of American power over the past few decades, American power has done a lot to stabilize the world. And you say, oh, stabilize, we have a war here, a war there. It would be even worse.
Yeah.
Don't say things can't get worse, because they can get worse. And I think, what we're going to see is an America that's not benign anymore, so to speak. And that will lead to more turbulence in the international system. A world of great powers is stabilizing to some extent. But if you have a world where the greatest power is not interested in, in what you said, in global order, so to speak, then you have a much more unstable world. The Middle East, for instance, if you say, what's the secret sauce behind all the wars that we've seen in the Middle East the past few years, the Iranians, the Israelis, and the Saudis, it's that everyone in the region knows America is not as strong as it used to be.
Yeah.
And therefore they have to carve out their own regional power centers, so to speak.
All right. With that sense of uncertainty, an invitation to come back next year when we try and figure out how we get ourselves through there. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Robert Kaplan.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
I'm just going to finish up by saying one thing and a thank you. The one thing I wanted to say, which is an attempt to try and draw everything together in a single story, is this. I was listening to Federico, the Argentine Minister of Deregulation, and when he talked about mate and mate exports, I was reminded of, I don't know whether anyone knows the story about Pope Francis. Do you know the lovely story about the late Pope Francis? That he was walking across St. Peter's, and he was stopped by a group of Argentine pilgrims who gave him some mate and said, you know, Papa Francesco, we're here from Argentina, would you like some mate that we brought for you? And so, of course, Pope Francis drank the mate, and his bodyguards lost their minds. They're like, you know, Holy Father, what are you doing? You don't know who these people are. And he said, I do know who they are. They're pilgrims. They're not cardinals. And I've always loved that story. I guess the thing I wanted to say was, at the end of today, it feels as though if there is a thread that runs through the whole thing, it's this idea that we need to trust more of the pilgrims and possibly be a little more suspicious of the cardinals. So on that note, I hope that you feel as though you've had a very useful day, that the time has been worth it. As I think you can tell, I always feel incredibly lucky to get to come to these days, because there is just an incredible collection of people who give you an insight on the world that you probably never get, or I certainly never do, anywhere other than in this room. So that is obviously not the work of people like me and Jamil and Tim and the others who get to ask the questions. It's really thanks to the incredible work that Barbara and Manolo and Theo and Celia and a bunch of people who are tucked behind this screen do to make sure that we can all learn as much as we do in the course of today. I hope that you found it useful. I look forward to seeing you next year, and I'll make sure that I have a throat sweet before I see you then. Thank you very much. Have a very good day.